The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating base Sentinel like a razor through silk. Captain Marcus Kane's coffee grew cold in his grip as the voice on the other end delivered news that would haunt him for the rest of his military career. 12 hours earlier, a Marine reconnaissance unit designated Hammersix had vanished into the Hindu Kush mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Their last transmission was a desperate plea for immediate extraction, followed by nothing but static and the endless whisper of mountain wind across the communication channels. The briefing room filled with the acrid smell of burned coffee and the nervous energy of men who had seen too much war. Intelligence suggested Hammersix had stumbled into something far more dangerous than a routine patrol. Satellite imagery showed unusual movement patterns in a valley that should have been empty, and intercepted communications hinted at a high-value target meeting that had gone catastrophically wrong. The Marines were trapped in terrain so hostile that even the Taliban called it the Valley of Bones. Captain Kane studied the topographical maps spread across the table like a surgeon examining a terminal patient. The valley was a geographic nightmare, a narrow corridor flanked by peaks that scraped the belly of heaven itself, with weather patterns that could shift from clear skies to whiteout conditions in minutes. The approach required threading through mountain passes so tight that aircraft had to fly single file, while surface-to-air missiles waited like patient predators in the shadows of ancient rock formations. "Sir," came a voice from the back of the room, calm and measured despite the gravity of the situation. "I can get them out." Every head in the briefing room turned toward the source of that voice. Captain Vera Phoenix Castellano stood near the wall, her flight suit bearing the patches of the 355th Fighter Squadron. At 5'4", she seemed dwarfed by the towering male pilots surrounding her, but her dark eyes held the steady confidence of someone who had already calculated the impossible and found it merely challenging. The A-10 Thunderbolt II was her aircraft of choice, a machine built around a massive 30 cannon, designed to survive in the most hostile environments on Earth. Kane's expression shifted from surprise to something approaching disbelief. "Castellanos, that valley is a death trap. We've already lost 2 helicopters trying to get close. The weather alone would ground most aircraft, and intelligence suggests at least 3 SAM sites covering the approaches." Phoenix stepped forward, her boots echoing against the concrete floor with measured precision. "Respectfully, sir, the A-10 wasn't built to play it safe." The radio crackled again with static, as if the mountains themselves were listening, waiting to claim another victim in their ancient, unforgiving embrace. Phoenix had earned her call sign 3 years earlier during her first deployment to Iraq, when she'd brought her damaged A-10 home through a sandstorm that had grounded every other aircraft on base. The Warthog's right engine had been shredded by small arms fire. Hydraulic fluid was painting crimson streaks across the desert floor, and her radio had been reduced to intermittent bursts of static and prayer. But she'd nursed that wounded bird through 70 miles of hostile territory, landing on a runway that existed more in hope than reality, with fuel fumes where fuel should have been and determination where fear might have lived in a lesser pilot. The other pilots had watched her climb out of that cockpit with a mixture of awe and bewilderment. Most of them still saw her as an outsider, a woman in a profession that remained stubbornly masculine, despite official policy changes and diversity initiatives. They'd whisper about quotas and lowered standards when they thought she couldn't hear, never acknowledging that she'd graduated top of her class from flight school or that her gunnery scores consistently outperformed theirs. Captain Kane had been different from the start. He'd seen Phoenix's potential when others saw only her gender, recognizing that her smaller stature actually provided advantages in the cramped cockpit of an A-10, and that her methodical approach to mission planning compensated for any perceived physical limitations. But even Kane hesitated now, studying the satellite images that showed a landscape seemingly designed by malevolent gods to destroy aircraft. "The approach corridor is less than half a mile wide in some sections," Kane said, tracing the route with his finger. One miscalculation and you're painting the mountainside with aviation fuel. And that's assuming you make it past the SAM sites without becoming a fireworks display. Phoenix moved to the map, her finger following a different route, one that hugged the valley floor where radar coverage would be minimal, using the terrain to mask her approach until the last possible moment. The Warthog can handle terrain following at altitudes that would make other aircraft kiss the ground. And if I come in low enough, those SAM sites won't have enough time to acquire a firing solution. Major Richardson, the squadron's executive officer, shook his head with the kind of weariness that came from watching too many good pilots chase glory into early graves. Phoenix, this isn't about proving yourself. Those Marines are already dead, we just haven't found the bodies yet. The words hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, but Phoenix's expression didn't change, her dark eyes fixed on the map with laser-like intensity. The briefing room fell silent except for the distant rumble of generators and the eternal whisper of wind across the base's defensive barriers. Outside, the first hints of dawn were beginning to paint the eastern horizon with shades of amber and gold, colors that reminded Phoenix of home, of New Mexico sunrises, and her father's weathered hands teaching her to work on aircraft engines in their backyard hangar. He'd been an Air Force mechanic, and she'd absorbed his lessons about machines and flying with the desperate hunger of someone who knew, even as a child, that the sky was where she belonged. Her mother had wanted something different for her: college, marriage, grandchildren, who would carry on the family name in ways that didn't involve risking everything for strangers in foreign lands. But Phoenix had inherited her father's stubborn streak along with his mechanical aptitude, and the compromise they'd reached was that she would serve her country while pursuing her dreams, even if those dreams terrified the people who loved her most. Kane studied Phoenix's face, searching for any sign of doubt or bravado that might indicate this was about personal glory rather than professional calculation. What he saw instead was the calm assessment of someone who had already accepted the risks and moved beyond fear into pure operational planning. It was the look of a pilot who understood that sometimes the difference between mission success and failure came down to the willingness to attempt what others considered impossible. "The weather window closes in 4 hours," Phoenix continued, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was proposing. "After that, the Marines won't matter because they'll be dead, and we'll be explaining to their families why we didn't try everything possible to bring them home." Major Richardson opened his mouth to object, but Kane raised a hand, silencing him before the words could form. The weight of command settled across Kane's shoulders like a burial shroud. He'd sent pilots on dangerous missions before, but never into conditions that offered such minimal chances of success. The mathematics of survival were brutal: narrow flight corridors, hostile weather, enemy surface-to-air missiles, and terrain that could kill an aircraft as efficiently as any weapon system. Even if Phoenix made it to the Marines' location, extraction would require precision flying that bordered on the supernatural. But those 12 Marines were counting on someone, anyone, to attempt the impossible. Their families were probably awake now, sensing with the intuition that came from loving someone in uniform that this day would bring news no parent or spouse should ever have to receive. Kane had written too many letters expressing the nation's gratitude for ultimate sacrifice, and he knew that every decision he made in the next few minutes would echo through generations of family gatherings and empty chairs at dinner tables. Phoenix sensed his internal struggle and pressed her advantage with the kind of tactical awareness that made her an exceptional pilot. "Sir, the A-10 was built for exactly this kind of mission: low-altitude penetration, close air support in contested environments, and the ability to absorb damage that would destroy other aircraft. If anyone can thread that needle, it's the Warthog." Kane looked around the briefing room at the assembled pilots, seeing in their faces the same mixture of admiration and skepticism that had followed Phoenix throughout her career. They respected her skills, but this mission pushed beyond skill into the realm of luck and divine intervention. The margin for error was so narrow that it barely existed, and everyone in the room understood that they might be witnessing either the birth of a legend or the planning of a funeral. "Castellanos," Kane said finally, his voice carrying the weight of command and the burden of potentially sending someone he respected to their death. "If I authorize this mission, you're going in alone. No wingman, no backup, no cavalry riding to the rescue if things go sideways." Phoenix nodded, her expression unchanged. "Understood, sir." The radio crackled again, this time with an update from the missing Marines command element. Their last known position had been confirmed through drone surveillance, and thermal imaging suggested at least some members of Hammer-6 were still alive. But enemy forces were moving into the area in increasing numbers, turning what had been a rescue mission into a race against time and overwhelming odds. Kane made his decision with the kind of finality that defined military leadership. "Mission authorized. Phoenix, you have 2 hours to prep your bird and brief your flight plan. Whether communications and intelligence will provide full support. And Castellanos," he paused, meeting her eyes across the briefing room, "bring our boys home." Phoenix's A-10 Thunderbolt II sat on the tarmac like a predator waiting for dawn, her twin turbofan engines gleaming silver in the harsh fluorescent lighting of the maintenance hangar. The aircraft bore the scars of previous missions, patches of different colored paint where battle damage had been repaired, replacement panels that didn't quite match the original camouflage pattern, and the kind of weathering that came from hard use in unforgiving environments. But every rivet was solid, every system tested, every weapon loaded with the precision that meant the difference between mission success and catastrophic failure. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos, Phoenix's crew chief, completed his pre-flight inspection with the methodical care of someone whose reputation depended on keeping aircraft and pilots alive. He'd worked on A-10s for 12 years, and he could diagnose engine problems by sound, identify structural issues by touch, and predict system failures through intuition born of experience. Santos had assigned himself to Phoenix's aircraft not because of any official directive, but because he recognized in her the kind of pilot who pushed machines to their absolute limits and needed a crew chief who understood both the aircraft's capabilities and the thin line between aggressive flying and reckless stupidity. "She's ready, Lieutenant," Santos reported, wiping hydraulic fluid from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades. "All systems green, full load of 30, and enough fuel to get you there and back with some to spare for creative navigation." Phoenix nodded, running through her own external inspection with practiced efficiency. The A-10's massive GAU-8 Avenger cannon dominated the aircraft's nose, a 7-barrel rotary gun capable of firing 3,900 rounds per minute of armor-piercing shells that could destroy tanks and turn enemy positions into smoking craters. Mounted beneath the wings were additional weapon systems, Maverick missiles for precision strikes, cluster bombs for area denial, and rocket pods loaded with high-explosive warheads that could clear landing zones or suppress enemy positions. But the A-10's most important feature wasn't its weapons. It was its ability to survive damage that would destroy other aircraft. The cockpit was surrounded by a titanium bathtub designed to protect the pilot from ground fire. The fuel system was self-sealing, and redundant flight controls meant the aircraft could continue flying even with significant battle damage. It was a machine built by people who understood that close air support required getting close to the enemy, and getting close to the enemy meant accepting that the enemy would shoot back. The weather briefing had been sobering. Mountain winds gusting to 40 knots, visibility dropping to less than half a mile in some sections, and cloud ceilings that would force her to fly so low that ground fire became a constant threat. The meteorologist, a young captain whose enthusiasm for atmospheric science couldn't quite mask his worry about the mission, had concluded his briefing with the kind of understated military language that translated to civilians as probably impossible. Phoenix strapped herself into the cockpit with movements refined by thousands of hours of practice, her hands finding switches and controls without conscious thought. The A-10's cockpit was utilitarian rather than elegant, every surface covered with switches, gauges, displays, and controls necessary for survival in contested airspace. But to Phoenix, it felt like home in ways that no building ever had. This was where she belonged, where her training and instincts merged into something greater than the sum of their parts. The engine spooled up with a whine that grew into a roar, vibrations traveling through the airframe like a heartbeat. Phoenix completed her engine checks, tested flight controls, verified weapon systems, and ran through emergency procedures with the kind of methodical preparation that distinguished professional aviators from weekend pilots. Every action was deliberate, every check confirmed, every system verified to be operating within acceptable parameters. Tower cleared her for takeoff into a sky that promised nothing but challenges. They accelerated down the runway with surprising grace for an aircraft designed primarily to survive rather than impress, lifting off into air that tasted of dust, aviation fuel, and the metallic tang of approaching weather. Phoenix banked toward the mountains, their peaks disappearing into clouds that looked like fortress walls built by giants who didn't welcome visitors. The flight to the valley would take 90 minutes through terrain that tested both pilot skill and aircraft capability. Phoenix settled into the rhythm of mountain flying, reading weather patterns in cloud formations, anticipating wind shear from valley thermals, navigating through passes that required precision measured in feet rather than miles. The A-10 responded to her inputs with mechanical honesty, translating her commands into action without the computer-assisted smoothness of newer fighters. This was flying in its purest form, where pilot skill mattered more than automated systems. Radio chatter from the base grew fainter as distance and mountains interfered with communications. Soon, she would be flying through a world where the only voices she heard would be her own thoughts and the steady rumble of turbofan engines carrying her toward 12 Marines who were counting on anyone, to attempt the impossible. The mountains ahead looked like the edge of the world, their peaks sharp enough to cut the sky itself. Phoenix had studied the target area until she could navigate it blind, memorizing every ridge, valley, and potential landing site within 50 miles of Hammer 6's last known position. The Marines had been conducting reconnaissance in a region where intelligence suggested high-value targets were meeting to plan operations against coalition forces. What they'd found instead was a trap, enemy forces in numbers far exceeding anything their briefings had suggested, positioned with the kind of tactical sophistication that indicated professional military training rather than insurgent enthusiasm. The valley stretched before her like a scar across the landscape, narrow and deep, with walls so steep that shadows seemed to pool at the bottom like spilled ink. Weather conditions were deteriorating exactly as predicted, with clouds building against the mountain faces and visibility dropping minute by minute. Phoenix checked her instruments, confirmed her position using GPS navigation, and began her descent into terrain that had been claiming aircraft since the first pilot had been brave enough or foolish enough to fly through mountain passes. At 8,000 feet above sea level, the air was thin enough to affect engine performance and dense enough to hide surface-to-air missiles until they were already in flight. Phoenix's radar warning receiver remained silent, but that didn't mean she was safe. It meant the enemy was either not present, not yet aware of her approach, or sophisticated enough to maintain radio silence until the optimal moment for engagement. In her experience, the third option was usually the correct one. The A-10's terrain-following radar painted a picture of the landscape ahead, but Phoenix relied more on visual navigation and instinct developed through years of flying in conditions that challenged both machine and pilot. The aircraft responded to turbulence with the kind of solid stability that came from robust engineering and acceptance that elegance was secondary to survival. She was flying a machine designed by people who understood that war was not a video game, and that pilots needed aircraft capable of completing missions under conditions that would ground civilian aviation. Her radio crackled with an update from base. Enemy activity in the target area was increasing, with multiple signals intercepts suggesting that hostile forces were converging on Hammer 6's position. The Marines were running out of time, and Phoenix was running out of altitude as the valley walls rose around her like the sides of a grave. She pushed the A-10 lower, using the terrain to mask her approach while accepting the increased risk of ground fire and the decreased reaction time if something went wrong. The mountains seemed to press closer with every mile, their peaks disappearing into clouds that looked increasingly threatening. Phoenix had flown through worse weather, but never in terrain this unforgiving, and never with the knowledge that 12 lives depended on her ability to thread a needle that most pilots wouldn't attempt even in perfect conditions. Ahead, the valley branched into multiple corridors, each one a potential path to the Marine's position, and each one a potential dead end that could trap her in terrain with no room for maneuvering. Phoenix had chosen her route based on intelligence reports and topographical analysis, but intelligence reports were often wrong, and topographical maps couldn't account for actual weather conditions or enemy positions. She was flying into the unknown, guided by training, instinct, and the kind of determination that separated professional military aviators from people who simply knew how to fly aircraft. The valley walls closed in until Phoenix could see individual rocks and trees on the mountainsides, their details sharp in the thin mountain air despite the deteriorating visibility. She was flying below the peaks now, in a world where the sky was reduced to a narrow ribbon overhead, and every decision had to be made quickly and correctly because there would be no opportunity for second chances. The A-10's engines echoed off the valley walls, announcing her presence to anyone with ears to hear, but stealth was no longer possible in terrain this confined. She was committed now to a course of action that would either result in successful rescue or spectacular failure. Her radio crackled with an incoming transmission, weak and broken by interference from the surrounding mountains. Any station, this is Hammer 6 Actual. We are in immediate need of extraction. Enemy forces closing on our position from multiple directions. Request immediate air support over. Phoenix keyed her microphone, her voice steady despite the adrenaline beginning to flood her system. Hammer 6 Actual, this is Phoenix. I'm inbound to your position. Transmit your exact coordinates and mark your position with signal flares if you have them. The response came back tinged with disbelief and desperate hope. Phoenix, this is Hammer 6. Grid coordinates 34.2589 north, 69.1234 east. We have wounded and are taking effective fire from elevated positions. Be advised, enemy has sophisticated air defense systems in the area. Phoenix checked her navigation display and calculated distance to target. 15 minutes of flying through terrain that grew more challenging with every mile. The Marines were trapped in a section of valley where the walls were so steep that extraction by helicopter would be nearly impossible, which explained why previous rescue attempts had failed. But the A-10 wasn't a helicopter. It was a fixed-wing aircraft designed to operate in conditions where other aircraft feared to venture. She pushed the throttles forward, increasing airspeed despite the increased risk of collision with terrain or inability to react quickly enough to changing conditions. Time was running out for Hammer 6, and every minute of delay increased the likelihood that she would arrive to find nothing but bodies and regret. The A-10 responded to her demands with mechanical compliance, turbofan engines providing the power necessary to maintain flight in thin air and challenging conditions. The valley began to widen slightly, providing marginally more room for maneuvering, but also exposing her to potential ground fire from multiple directions. Phoenix's eyes scanned the terrain constantly, looking for muzzle flashes, missile launches, or any indication that the enemy had detected her approach. The A-10's armor could withstand significant battle damage, but even titanium had limits, and she was flying into an environment where those limits might be tested. Ahead, she could see smoke rising from what appeared to be Hammer 6's position. Whether from signal flares or enemy fire was impossible to determine at this distance. But it confirmed that the Marines were still alive and still fighting, which meant the mission retained the possibility of success, despite the overwhelming odds against survival. The radio crackled again with traffic from the base, requesting updates on her status and progress toward the target. Phoenix ignored the transmissions, focusing entirely on flying through terrain that demanded complete attention and left no mental capacity for administrative communications. She would report when the mission was complete, assuming she survived to make such a report. The valley walls seemed to lean inward like giants preparing to clap their hands together, with Phoenix and her A-10 caught between stone palms that could crush aircraft as easily as insects. But she had trained for this, flying through terrain that challenged every aspect of pilot skill and aircraft capability, navigating by instruments and instinct through conditions that separated professional aviators from people who merely knew how to operate flying machines. Suddenly, her radar warning receiver screamed to life with a tone that every combat pilot learned to fear: surface-to-air missile lock. Somewhere in the valley ahead, an enemy operator had acquired her aircraft and was preparing to engage. Phoenix's training took over, her hands moving to countermeasure systems while her mind calculated angles, distances, and probabilities. The game had changed from rescue to survival, and the next few seconds would determine whether she became the solution to Hammer 6's problem, or simply another casualty of war in an unforgiving landscape. The missile launch came from a position she hadn't anticipated, not from the valley floor where intelligence had suggested Sam's sights might be located, but from a hidden emplacement carved into the valley wall itself, cleverly positioned to catch aircraft flying the exact route she had chosen. The surface-to-air missile streaked upward on a column of white smoke, its guidance system already locked onto the A-10's heat signature and radar return. Phoenix had perhaps 3 seconds to react before the missile's proximity fuse detonated its warhead in a sphere of expanding shrapnel designed to shred aircraft and kill pilots. Her response was instantaneous and calculated, born of countless hours training for exactly this scenario. Phoenix rolled the A-10 inverted and pulled hard toward the valley floor, diving toward terrain that most pilots would consider suicidal in an attempt to break the missile's lock and force it to impact harmlessly against the mountainside. The aircraft's G-meter climbed rapidly as she pulled maximum performance from airframe and engines, accepting the risk of structural failure in preference to certain destruction by guided ordnance. The missile passed so close to her aircraft that she could see its fins and guidance section through the cockpit canopy, missing the A-10's right wing by less than 20 feet before slamming into the opposite valley wall in an explosion that sent rock fragments cascading down the mountainside like deadly snow. Phoenix rolled wings level and climbed back to a sustainable altitude, her heart rate elevated but her hands steady on the controls. The first engagement was over, but enemy forces now knew exactly where she was and would be adjusting their defensive positions accordingly. "Phoenix, this is Hammer 6 Actual," came the voice on the radio, strained with pain and exhaustion. "We observed the SAM launch. Are you still operational?" "Hammer 6 Phoenix, I'm still flying. What's your current status?" The response painted a picture of desperate men fighting against overwhelming odds in terrain that offered minimal cover and no realistic escape routes. "Phoenix, we have 4 wounded, including 2 critical. Enemy forces have us surrounded and are closing from the north and east. We're in a small clearing approximately 500 meters from your current position, marked by red smoke." Phoenix could see the smoke now, rising from a patch of relatively flat ground that might accommodate an aircraft landing if the pilot was skilled enough and desperate enough to attempt it. But the clearing was well within range of enemy small arms fire, and landing would turn the A-10 from a mobile weapons platform into a stationary target that could be destroyed by infantry with basic training and sufficient determination. She keyed her microphone, her voice carrying the kind of calm authority that inspired confidence in ground forces who had learned to distinguish between pilots who talked confidently and pilots who delivered results. Hammer 6, I'm going to make a low pass to assess your situation and identify enemy positions. After that, we'll discuss extraction options. The A-10 dropped toward the valley floor, Phoenix using terrain features to mask her approach until the last possible moment. As she crested a ridge that had hidden her from enemy observers, the full scope of Hammer 6's predicament became apparent. The Marines were indeed surrounded, positioned in a clearing that offered some concealment but little cover, with enemy forces occupying elevated positions on three sides. Muzzle flashes from multiple locations indicated that the Marines were taking effective fire from at least a dozen hostile combatants armed with automatic weapons and rocket-propelled grenades. Phoenix's tactical assessment was instantaneous and troubling. The Marines were trapped in a killing zone with minimal defensive positions. Enemy forces held the high ground and numerical superiority, and the terrain made traditional extraction by helicopter nearly impossible. But the A-10 hadn't been designed for traditional missions. It had been built for situations where other aircraft couldn't or wouldn't venture, and this definitely qualified as such a situation. She began her attack run from the north, diving toward enemy positions while keeping the Marines' location clearly identified to prevent friendly fire incidents. The A-10's GAU-8 cannon began its distinctive roar, a sound like the fabric of reality being torn apart by mechanical fury. 30mm armor-piercing shells impacted enemy positions at a rate of nearly 70 rounds per second, turning defensive positions into craters and forcing surviving enemy combatants to seek cover rather than maintain effective fire on the trapped Marines. The first pass broke enemy cohesion and provided temporary relief for Hammer 6, but Phoenix knew the respite would be brief. Enemy forces would reposition and adapt their tactics, and she couldn't provide close air support indefinitely without running out of ammunition or fuel. The Marines needed extraction, not just fire support, and extraction would require landing in terrain that challenged every aspect of her pilot training. Phoenix climbed back to a safe altitude and began planning her next move, calculating fuel consumption, ammunition expenditure, and the rapidly decreasing window of opportunity for successful mission completion. The weather was continuing to deteriorate. Enemy forces were likely calling for reinforcements, and the Marines' condition was unknown beyond the initial report of multiple wounded. Every factor in the tactical equation pointed toward immediate action rather than extended planning. Hammer 6, this is Phoenix. I'm going to attempt a landing in your clearing. Prepare your wounded for immediate evacuation and establish defensive positions to cover my approach. The response carried a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. Phoenix, the clearing is only about 300 meters long and under direct fire from multiple positions. Are you sure you can get in and out? Phoenix was already calculating approach angles, landing distances, and takeoff requirements with the kind of mathematical precision that separated professional test pilots from weekend aviators. The numbers were challenging but not impossible, assuming perfect execution and no mechanical failures or enemy interference. In combat flying, those were significant assumptions. Hammer 6, I'll be on the ground for 30 seconds. Have your people ready to move. The A-10 was not designed for short-field landings in contested areas, but it possessed characteristics that made such operations possible if the pilot was willing to accept risks that exceeded normal operational parameters. Phoenix began her approach from the southeast, using a ridge line to mask her descent until she was committed to landing. The clearing appeared ahead, marked by red smoke that was quickly dispersed by rotor wash from her engines, and buffeted by mountain winds that could slam aircraft into the ground without warning. She touched down with a precision that would have impressed flight instructors, the A-10's rugged landing gear absorbing the impact of contact with unimproved terrain that was more suitable for mountain goats than military aircraft. Enemy fire immediately intensified, small arms rounds sparking off the aircraft's armored surfaces, while Phoenix kept engines running and prepared for immediate departure. The Marines emerged from their defensive positions carrying wounded comrades, moving with the kind of desperate efficiency that came from understanding that survival measured in seconds rather than minutes. Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Hammer Six's senior enlisted man, supervised the loading of wounded Marines while maintaining suppressive fire against enemy positions. "Phoenix, we've got 2 critical and 2 walking wounded. Give us 20 more seconds." Phoenix could feel enemy fire impacting her aircraft, the distinctive ping of small arms rounds against titanium armor mixing with the roar of turbofan engines and the shouts of Marines loading casualties. The A-10 was absorbing damage, but systems remained operational and the aircraft was still capable of flight. 20 seconds felt like 20 minutes when measured by the steady impact of hostile gunfire. The last Marine climbed aboard, and Phoenix began her takeoff roll immediately, not waiting for confirmation that everyone was secure. They accelerated down the improvised runway while enemy fire reached crescendo levels, muzzle flashes visible from multiple positions as hostile forces attempted to prevent their escape. Phoenix pulled the aircraft into the air with barely 50 meters of runway remaining, climbing steeply to clear the valley walls while accepting the increased risk of stall in preference to certain destruction by remaining within range of ground fire. They were airborne and alive, but the mission was far from complete. The wounded Marines needed immediate medical attention, whether conditions were continuing to deteriorate, and the A-10 had sustained battle damage that might affect its ability to complete the flight back to base. Phoenix began climbing towards safer altitude while conducting a quick assessment of aircraft systems and the condition of her passengers. The flight surgeon's voice crackled over the radio as Phoenix reported successful extraction and requested priority landing clearance for medical emergencies. Forward Operating Base Sentinel was 70 minutes away through weather that was rapidly approaching minimums for safe flight, and the A-10 was carrying 12 additional souls who were counting on her ability to navigate through conditions that challenged both aircraft capability and pilot skill. Phoenix settled into the rhythm of cross-country flight in deteriorating weather, her instruments providing navigation guidance while her eyes constantly scanned for other aircraft, hostile fire, or mechanical problems that could transform successful rescue into tragic failure. Behind her, the Marines of Hammer Six received first aid from their comrades while trying to process their transition from certain death to uncertain survival. The mountains began to recede behind them as Phoenix flew toward base, but the sky ahead looked no more forgiving than the terrain they were leaving. Weather conditions that had been merely challenging during the inbound flight were becoming genuinely dangerous for the return trip, with visibility dropping and winds increasing to levels that made instrument flight mandatory rather than optional. Radio contact with base was intermittent due to distance and atmospheric interference, but Phoenix was able to transmit periodic updates on their status and estimated time of arrival. The response from Captain Kane carried relief mixed with disbelief. No one had expected the mission to succeed, and the news that all 12 Marines were alive and inbound for medical treatment seemed almost too good to believe. Phoenix's fuel gauges showed consumption rates higher than planned, a consequence of the combat maneuvering and terrain flying required during the extraction phase. She calculated remaining fuel against distance to base and concluded that margins would be tight but adequate, assuming no further complications or delays. In combat flying, that assumption was always optimistic. The weather front they were flying through was typical of mountain regions, unpredictable, violent, and capable of changing from manageable to deadly within minutes. Phoenix flew primarily on instruments now, trusting gauges and navigation systems rather than visual references that were increasingly obscured by clouds and precipitation. The A-10 handled turbulence with characteristic stability, but each wind gust reminded her that they were flying through conditions at the edge of aircraft capability. Behind her, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez provided updates on the condition of wounded Marines. One of the critical casualties had stabilized during flight, while the other remained unconscious, but with vital signs that suggested survival was possible with proper medical treatment. The walking wounded were experiencing the kind of adrenaline crash that followed combat, their minds finally processing experiences that had been too intense to fully comprehend while they were occurring. Phoenix checked her navigation display and confirmed they were on course for base, with estimated arrival in 45 minutes. Fuel consumption remained within acceptable parameters, aircraft systems showed no signs of serious battle damage, and weather conditions, while challenging, were not yet beyond the A-10's capability to handle. For the first time since receiving the mission briefing, Phoenix allowed herself to believe that all 13 souls aboard her aircraft might survive to see another sunrise. The radio crackled with an update from base operations. "Phoenix, this is Sentinel Tower. Medical personnel are standing by for immediate casualty evacuation. Runway is clear and emergency equipment is positioned for your arrival." Phoenix acknowledged the transmission and began her descent toward forward operating base Sentinel, the familiar pattern of approach and landing procedures providing structure to a mission that had tested every aspect of her training and experience. The Marines behind her were going home, battered and wounded but alive, because someone had been willing to attempt what others had deemed impossible. The mountains fell away behind them as Phoenix guided the A-10 toward base, her aircraft bearing the scars of combat but still flying with the mechanical determination that characterized machines designed by people who understood that war was not a theoretical exercise. Ahead, runway lights cut through deteriorating visibility like a beacon, guiding them home from a mission that would be remembered long after the participants had returned to civilian life or moved on to other assignments. As the wheels touched down on familiar runway surface, Phoenix felt the satisfaction that came from successful mission completion in circumstances that had challenged every aspect of professional competence. The Marines of Hammersix were alive. Their families would not receive telegrams expressing national gratitude for ultimate sacrifice. And somewhere in the bureaucracy of military operations, someone would write a mission report that could never fully capture the reality of flying into terrain that existed at the intersection of skill, courage, and calculated desperation. The rolled to a stop near the medical facility, its engines winding down while ambulances and medical personnel surrounded the aircraft. Phoenix completed her shutdown procedures with mechanical precision, her hands steady despite the adrenaline that had sustained her through nearly 4 hours of flying at the edge of aircraft capability. Outside, the Marines of Hammersix were being transferred to stretchers and medical transport, their transition from combat to casualty care, supervised by professionals who understood that survival often depended on attention to details that seemed insignificant to civilian observers. Captain Kane appeared at her cockpit as Phoenix climbed out of the aircraft, his expression carrying the kind of respect that came from watching someone accomplish what he had considered impossible. "Phoenix, that was some of the finest flying I've ever witnessed. How's your bird?" Phoenix conducted a quick external inspection of her aircraft, noting bullet holes in non-critical areas, minor damage to external sensors, and the kind of wear that came from hard use in unforgiving environments. "She'll need some attention from maintenance, but nothing that can't be repaired. The A-10 is tougher than most people realize." The debriefing would come later, along with mission reports, commendations, and the administrative paperwork that transformed combat operations into historical records. But for now, Phoenix was content to watch medical personnel load the Marines into ambulances, while ground crews began assessing battle damage to her aircraft. 12 men were alive because she had been willing to fly into terrain where others feared to venture. And that knowledge provided a satisfaction that no official recognition could match.